It was early morning on June 4, 1942, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship, Akagi, wrestling with a critical decision. His fleet, meant to strike Midway, now faced an unexpected setback. As 6 American torpedo planes and 4 bombers from Midway approached, Nagumo watched in disbelief. His force had been discovered. The secret attack the entire operation hinged on was in jeopardy. As he barked his orders and sailors quickly moved to their battle stations, the first engagement of the Battle of Midway was about to begin. Ever since Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved major victories in the Pacific, capturing key territories for strategic and resource needs. The attacks had crippled much of the US Pacific Fleet, but it failed to destroy a critical target: the American aircraft carriers. These floating airfields posed a great threat to Japan's ability to dominate the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, envisioned a decisive sea battle to annihilate the remnants of the US Navy, a clash Japanese strategists had long anticipated. Yamamoto believed victory in such a confrontation would secure Japanese supremacy in the Pacific. With the US fleet eliminated, Japan could seize Hawaii, or even target California and the American West Coast. His ultimate goal was to force the United States into a truce, granting Japan free rein in the Western Pacific. However, Yamamoto, familiar with America's industrial might from his time there, understood the urgency of a quick victory. He knew that if the war extended beyond a year, American factories would unleash a torrent of ships, planes, and weaponry, ensuring Japan's defeat. Planning for further operations faced delays due to conflicts between the Imperial Army and Navy. Yamamoto ultimately prevailed, and the plan to lure and destroy American carrier forces by targeting Midway Atoll was set in motion. This plan, Operation MI, relied on complex coordination, deception, and the assumption that American morale was low. Japan's fleet was built around 4 powerful aircraft carriers, each capable of launching devastating attacks on the American positions at Midway. The first carrier striking force was under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The largest of these carriers was Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese carrier striking force, commanded by Captain Koshiro Oikawa. It was one of the largest and most powerful aircraft carriers in the world at the time. It included 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, 18 Aichi-Val dive bombers, and 18 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers. Commander of Akagi's air group was commanded by Mitsuo Fuchida, who later became an important eyewitness offering critical post-war insights. As the flagship, the Akagi was not only a vital operational hub, but also the focal point for Nagumo's command. Alongside the Akagi was the Kaga, another massive carrier that, like its counterpart, carried 72 aircraft. This carrier was under the command of Captain Kakuji Kakuta. Following closely were the Soryu and the Hiryu as part of the 2nd Carrier Division. Each was equipped with their own air groups of 63 and 60 aircraft respectively. These carriers, though slightly smaller, were no less dangerous. The Soryu was renowned for its speed and maneuverability, making it a dangerous force in the battle. The Hiryu, the 4th aircraft carrier in Nagumo's force, was the smallest of the 4. The Japanese fleet was further supported by a host of battleships, among them the super battleship Yamato, cruisers and destroyers, ready to provide close protection to the carriers and engage the US forces in a full-scale naval confrontation. They were also bolstered by a number of smaller vessels, including submarines, which were intended to harass the US forces. This massive fleet supported a convoy of 5,000 soldiers, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's Midway Occupation Force, who was supposed to seize the atoll's 2 islets, Sand and Eastern, in an amphibious assault. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto waited 300 miles to the west with his battleship flotilla, anticipating that the American Navy would rush to defend Midway. Yamamoto himself commanded aboard the super battleship Yamato. Other units included the Aleutian Northern Force, who would launch a diversionary attack against the Aleutian Islands preceding the attack, the Midway Invasion Force, and a guard force. In total, Yamamoto's task force boasted 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 21 submarines, a fleet unparalleled in power. However, Yamamoto was all too aware of his fleet's weaknesses. By June, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced critical limitations. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were unavailable due to damage and crew losses suffered at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The light carrier Shoho had been sunk during that same battle. Vice Admiral Nagumo was left with only 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, totaling over 240 aircraft, all fatigued from months of operations. Aircraft shortages compounded issues, with production of key planes like the Aichi Val and Nakajima Kate curtailed, leaving carriers with fewer and increasingly unreliable aircraft. Production and maintenance challenges left many Japanese planes worn out and unreliable. Yamamoto's approach hinged on 3 key assumptions. First, that the US fleet would not move until Midway was under attack. Second, that the Americans would have no more than 2 operational aircraft carriers. And third, that the Japanese assault would take their enemy entirely by surprise. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans were demoralized, and Japanese sailors openly boasted of an easy win. However, by late May, American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph J. Rochford, gave the Americans a crucial edge by partially breaking Japan's JN-25B code, confirming Midway Atoll as the target. After the attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent shelling of Midway, its defenses were rapidly bolstered. By December 17th, 17 Vought Vindicator dive bombers arrived, followed by 14 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters. By month's end, reinforcements included additional 5-inch, 3-inch, and 7-inch guns, as well as anti-aircraft weapons. A platoon of light tanks and 2 rifle companies joined the growing defense force. By late May, the cryptographers pinpointed the attack date and detailed Japan's order of battle, revealing dispersed task groups and limited carrier protection. Despite this advantage, the situation remained precarious. The US Navy was still reeling from the devastation at Pearl Harbor. Additionally, the US suffered serious losses during the Battle of the Coral Sea as well. They lost the carrier Lexington and saw Yorktown heavily damaged. In preparation for the battle against the Imperial Japanese Navy near Midway, a sudden change in leadership reshaped the US command structure. Admiral William Halsey, known for his aggressive leadership and success in earlier operations like the Doolittle Raid, was initially slated to lead. However, a severe illness forced Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, to appoint Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, Halsey's cruiser commander, in his place. Spruance, known for his composed and methodical leadership, was charged with halting the Japanese offensive by targeting their carriers while preserving the US fleet, a vital defense for Hawaii and the West Coast. Meanwhile, all available carriers were mobilized. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, included the USS Yorktown, which carried 60 aircraft under the command of Captain Elliot Buckmaster. When the Navy learned of Japan's plans for Midway, a crew of 1,400 men hastily repaired the carrier in just 72 hours. Its air group was a patchwork of experienced and novice crews. The Yorktown was accompanied by a strong air group, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, all coordinated under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson. Task Force 16, led by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, comprised the USS Enterprise with 65 aircraft, commanded by Captain George D. Murray and the USS Hornet, with 62 aircraft under the command of Captain Mark A. Mitcher. The aircraft of these 2 task forces were under the command of their respective air group commanders, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey on the Enterprise and Commander Stanhope C. Ring on the Hornet. At Midway itself, the island's defenses included Marine Aircraft Group 22, led by Colonel Ira L. Kimes, with 21 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, 19 SBD Dauntless bombers, and 17 Vindicator dive bombers, along with 29 additional PBY Catalina seaplanes, and a range of PT boats and coastal defense units stationed at key points across the Hawaiian archipelago. Additional air power included 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 4 B-26 Marauders, and 6 TBF Avengers. In total, Midway's defenders numbered 3,652 men and 120 aircraft, though some were outdated. It was a modest force compared to Yamamoto's armada. Spruance devised a plan to position his forces northeast of Midway, lying in wait for his scout planes to locate the Japanese fleet before Yamamoto's reconnaissance discovered the Americans. Timing was everything. If Spruance could strike first, he might cripple Japan's carriers and blunt their offensive momentum. However, the reverse could spell catastrophe, potentially dooming the US fleet. On May 27th, Yamamoto's fleet departed Hashirajima. Four days later, Admiral Yamamoto, noticing increased American radio transmissions, had grown suspicious that a significant US naval presence might be positioned closer than anticipated, potentially near Hawaii. Yet committed to maintaining radio silence, he chose not to alert Nagumo's strike carrier force. Leading the Japanese fleet of 4 carriers, Nagumo pressed on toward Midway, confident that only minor resistance awaited him. Japanese reconnaissance efforts faltered as well. Submarines stationed around Oahu failed to spot the American fleet by a margin of just 1 day. Aerial reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, which might have confirmed the fleet's position, was abandoned when an American seaplane tender was discovered at French frigate Shoals, the intended launch site for observation planes. On June 3rd, US reconnaissance aircraft spotted a string of ships on the horizon. These were Admiral Tanaka's transports and destroyers. At approximately 12:30, 9 B-17 bombers of the 431st Bombardment Squadron took to the skies, tasked with striking the Japanese forces. Several hours later, the bombers located the Japanese transport group. From altitudes exceeding 8,000 feet, the B-17s released their 600-pound bombs, but the results were less than hoped for. Reports of hits were deemed inaccurate, and no casualties were reported on either side. Yet, the message was unmistakable. The Japanese had been detected. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and his commanders, however, remained focused on their primary target, Nagumo's aircraft carriers, which were still unlocated. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo, oblivious to the presence of 3 American aircraft carriers nearby, positioned his carriers into the wind to launch his own offensive, aiming to neutralize Midway's airstrip, eliminate further aerial threats, and soften the island's defenses for the planned amphibious invasion. The following morning, the Japanese initiated their first strike against Midway Island at 4:30, as Nagumo launched 72 bombers and 36 fighters, commanded by Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. Another 126 aircraft remained aboard his carriers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, specifically designed for attacking ships, ready to engage if any American vessels appeared. Midway's radar detected Japanese forces 93 miles away, prompting American fighters to intercept. A fierce dogfight followed, with the highly agile Japanese Zeros proving dominant. 24 American fighters were lost, with only 10 returning, of which 2 remained airworthy. The Japanese pressed on, and the subsequent bombing raid destroyed a hangar, freshwater processing facility, and the powerhouse, with over 36 American casualties. 11 Japanese aircraft were shot down during the assault. Then, by 5:34, a PBY reconnaissance plane from Midway Island struck gold. It detected Nagumo's carriers. Shortly after, another PBY reported incoming enemy planes, signaling an imminent Japanese attack. Radar confirmed the strike force 90 miles out, prompting frantic preparations. Colonel Kimes scrambled all available fighters to intercept the attackers and bombers to strike the carriers. Midway's mixed bomber force, lacking coordination and fighter cover, launched piecemeal attacks on the Japanese fleet. Minutes later, Rear Admiral Spruance learned of the carrier force's presence. Calmly assessing the situation, he plotted the fleet's position, noting they were within the range of his torpedo planes. With Nagumo's carriers recovering their Midway strike group, their vulnerability was at its peak. However, his carriers were too far away to launch a strike right away. First, he had to close in. Meanwhile, as the Japanese squadron which had attacked Midway flew back to their carriers, the strike commander radioed a report to Nagumo. A second attack would be necessary to neutralize the island's defenses. At 7:15, his concerns about the threat from Midway-based aircraft led to the decision to prepare for a second strike on the atoll. He ordered torpedoes on Akagi and Kaga's Kates replaced with high-explosive bombs and Soryu and Hiryu's Vals armed for land targets. This was a time-intensive task, losing valuable time the Japanese unknowingly did not have. Rearming them would take at least an hour, leaving his carriers exposed should enemy planes arrive during this vulnerable window. Admiral Nagumo could not grapple too long with his next move. Before the bulk of the Japanese squadron returned, 6 American torpedo planes and 4 bombers from Midway already arrived. Commanded by Lieutenant Langdon Feebeling, they immediately launched their assault on his fleet. The Japanese gunners watched in disbelief as the American aircraft charged headlong into the fray without fighter escorts. Such a maneuver, one of the officers noted, defied conventional tactics and bordered on suicidal. Still, they kept coming in, flying low over the water, he later wrote. Black plumes of anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, yet the Americans pressed forward. As the Akagi's guns roared to life, 3 Japanese Zero fighters streaked into action, weaving through their own fleet's fire to intercept the attackers. In rapid succession, 3 American planes were engulfed in flames and crashed into the ocean. Despite the carnage, the surviving aircraft held course and launched their torpedoes before succumbing to anti-aircraft fire. The result was grim. Most of the American planes were lost, with minimal damage inflicted on the Japanese fleet. 1 aircraft collided with the deck of the Akagi, but the impact caused little harm. Only 3 of the attacking planes made it back to Midway. While their efforts seemed futile, the attack further cemented Nagumo's decision. Midway had to be struck again. But then, Nagumo received a chilling message. One of his scout planes spotted wakes and reported 10 ships 240 miles from Midway. These were, in fact, US carriers. The chaos aboard Akagi when news broke of American ships in the vicinity was indescribable, as Nagumo and his staff frantically sought confirmation of these ships. Nagumo was now cornered by an impossible choice. The returning planes from the first strike on Midway were low on fuel and urgently needed to land. If he delayed their recovery to continue rearming for a second strike on Midway, the aircraft risked running out of fuel and crashing into the ocean. On the other hand, halting the rearming process would leave his fleet unprepared to counter a potential attack from the approaching American ships. Nagumo messaged the Tone scout plane for more details, specifically asking if the enemy force included aircraft carriers. But before he received a reply, the rumbling of engines in the sky saw another wave of American planes attack. 16 Marine Corps Dauntless dive bombers under Major Lofton Henderson approached the Kido Butai. They faced devastating resistance. Lacking proper dive bombing training, Henderson led a glide bombing attack instead, which made his planes vulnerable to the defending Zero fighters. The Zeros tore through the formation, shooting down Henderson's plane early in the assault. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore through the formation, downing half of the attackers. The remaining planes were forced to withdraw without landing a single hit on the Japanese ships. This relentless but ineffective attack rattled Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. The appearance of carrier-based planes made him suspect the presence of an American carrier nearby, a possibility that injected doubt into the Japanese High Command's earlier confidence. 15 minutes after Henderson's group attacked, a formation of 15 Army B-17 Flying Fortresses, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Walter C. Sweeney, arrived overhead. From high altitudes, the bombers released their payloads, but every bomb missed its target, splashing harmlessly into the ocean. Although the attack caused no physical damage, it forced Nagumo's ships to scatter and disrupted the fleet's cohesion. The Marine Corps' battered Dauntless survivors had a harrowing return journey. With Major Lofton Henderson gone and their formation scattered, many pilots navigated alone. The ordeal was grim. Only 8 planes returned to Midway, riddled with bullet holes, one with 179, another with 219. By 8:20, a third wave of attackers, 11 more obsolete Vindicators under Major Benjamin Norris, joined the fray. Their pilots, many unfamiliar with the aircraft, targeted a Japanese battleship rather than searching for the carriers. Zeros swarmed them immediately, downing several, while flak from the battleship's anti-aircraft guns buffeted the flimsy planes. They too failed to score any significant hits, but their persistent presence further frayed Nagumo's nerves. The casualties among the US pilots were steep. 19 planes were shot down, while only 3 Zeros were downed. While none of the initial American strikes inflicted serious damage, they succeeded in another critical way. They kept Nagumo's fleet on the defensive, throwing off his carefully orchestrated plans. The waves of American attacks forced Nagumo to delay his attack, creating the opening Spruance and Fletcher's carrier groups needed to prepare their own assault. It wasn't until after these 3 waves of attacks that Nagumo finally heard back from the scout plane that had first reported the US naval force. It now confirmed the presence of an American aircraft carrier among the enemy ships. For Nagumo, this revelation posed a dire threat to his plans and demanded immediate action. His options were limited. With his Midway attack planes approaching low on fuel, Nagumo decided, recover and refuel those aircraft, then rearm his entire strike force to target the American carriers. As Nagumo's fleet scrambled to recover, rearm, and refuel its aircraft, a silence loomed over the Pacific. The scattered American attacks had all been planes launched from Midway. No carrier aircraft had yet reached the Japanese carrier division, a conspicuous absence that must have troubled the Japanese high command. With their Zeros depleted and decks in disarray, the Kido Butai was vulnerable, unaware that the true threat was already closing in. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.